All right. So for those of you who are paying close attention, you may notice I've added another piece of art. I came across Da Vinci's study in one of his notebooks of youth and age. Uh, Probably just side by side drawings. Da Vinci just liked to use every inch of every page, but another image illustrating the themes. And so obviously I'm going to return to the lecture series that we've been engaged in for a couple of months now. I'm on my way to completing it. I'm anticipating that there's going to be plenty to talk about on other fronts in the coming month, among other things, whether or not a former president is going to be indicted and what that might mean for our politics, but also the chatbot revolution in artificial intelligence and what that uh, how that may affect human culture, human nature, as well as society and politics. Those are two big ideas I'm thinking about these days, in addition to what's happening in the Ukraine, what's happening in US-Chinese relations, the new report on global warming from the UN. So there's a good reason to try to conclude these lectures to get on to other material, but I do want to do justice to what we've been talking about for some time now. So I'll just remind you that the course has been built on the foundation of a unit that looked really at the medical science, the neuroscience, and the psychology of aging, drawing on some of the most interesting recent work on these topics. And that we came to the conclusion, I think, that not only that ageism is perhaps one of the last widely tolerated forms of prejudice and discrimination in our society, but like so much else that's prejudice and discrimination, it's founded on false belief, and in particular, a kind of homogenizing view of old age, of elderhood, to use, I think, the preferable term, as uniform decline, and that in fact what we should conclude based on medical science as well as cognitive science is that there is some inevitable decline, especially as one gets up into 90s or 100, but that there is actually a much more heterogeneous process in which for many individuals, actual aspects of memory, of cognition, get stronger as they get older, and that it's possible to compensate, and that in general, we don't do ourselves any favors. We really misguide our understanding of elderhood if we judge this last third of our lives by the standards of the middle third of our lives. No more would we be appropriate in judging childhood by the standards of adulthood than we are appropriate instead in understanding elderhood by the standards of adulthood. And this then, right, has some pretty important implications. If we have accurate and therefore less negative age beliefs, we will have less stress as we age. That's not just a description of a psychological state of being anxious. It is a physiological state that has actual biological markers, and that it turns out is tremendously unhealthy for us. If cortisol production is one of the main biological markers of aging, one of the things we see is that people with negative age beliefs have much higher rates of cortisol as they age. People with positive age belief actually have a slight decrease in the presence of this quite pathogenic stress hormone when they age. And perhaps for this reason, although not probably for this reason alone, people who have negative age beliefs live on average 7.5 years less than people with positive age beliefs, and people with negative age beliefs have a much higher incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's as well. And so that's one takeaway from the first unit. I think the broader takeaway is once we adjust our understanding of elderhood, get rid of the ageist assumption that it's uniform debility and decline, and replace it instead with the idea that actually it can be one of the most ambitious, meaningful, and rewarding phases of life, that we then need to restructure both our lives and our society accordingly to make the full range of human goods available in age appropriate forms during elderhood. That includes access to public space, access to meaningful work, access to good care, access to financial security, among other things. And so um, adjusting our understanding of the increased possibilities opened with the increased lifespan involves not just a psychological reorientation, but a fundamental change in the way we organize our society and our understanding of our ethical and political obligations. We then transition to a second group of thinkers, and these are women who are more interested in the social provision of care in America, especially in the 21st century, and the distribution of the obligation to provide care, or the distribution of the labor of providing care. And in various ways, all of them point to both the inadequacy of the care we provide, the unfairness of the way it's distributed, who receives care, and the unfair and degrading conditions in which care providers often work, right? And so a more sociological understanding of how the lifespan revolution is straining our ad hoc infrastructure of care provision in America in the 21st century. And so we focused in particular, when we were concluding our discussion 2 weeks ago, before we took a side path for a few minutes to discuss the banking crisis at Silicon Valley Bank and its broader implications for the economy, right? We discussed how the current political discourse and I think more broadly cultural discourse around care has been shaped by the history, and in particular by a history that quite recently, right, and really only in the middle of the 20th century, assigned care work to the private sphere of the household and as the primary obligation and occupation of women, the so-called housewifeification of the provision of care. And that this combined with then the more recent transformation, which has created two earner families, two worker families, and then at least among middle class people and upper middle class people, as well as the wealthy, reliance on paid care labor, and the fact that paid care labor is typically provided by women who are often racial minorities, who are less well educated, and who are quite frequently recent immigrants, sometimes without documented status. That all of these forces combined have rendered marginal, have prevented us from focusing on what is a genuine crisis of care already in the United States in the 2020s, and a crisis of care that is only going to be amplified and worsened by the lifespan revolution, as a larger and larger share of our population will require support, will require care, either informally from members of their own family, who are going to be all the more stressed and stretched in multiple different directions by the need to work, the need to provide for their own families, the need to care for their own children, but also to care for elder relatives. and right, that at the same time, our formal provision of care, our waged care labor system, is woefully inadequate, totally patchwork, and often involves the exploitation and degradation of the people who provide it, right? And so that's the crisis of care. And then there's the total absence of political attention to this crisis. And I'm going to suggest as we get further into the topic that this creates, in a sense, an opportunity for a political entrepreneur or political entrepreneurs to begin really focusing on this topic. And that if we do find the vocabulary, the attention, the political resources to render the crisis of care focal, that it may very well resonate with broad swaths of the population, given that the experience is there, the crisis is there already, and that it is making life very difficult for many people, that it is making it difficult to discharge some of our most urgent obligations, our obligations to our children, to our spouses, and to our parents. Our filial obligations are strained to the point of breaking in a society that has privatized, marginalized, neglected the provision of care. So the idea that this has been further amplified by the neoliberal economic revolution, by the idea that we have privatized these obligations, essentially said the state is not responsible for any of this, and essentially suggested that the market can solve these problems and that individuals are solely responsible for them. If you reach that point in life where your child is in college and your parents require greater assistance and you haven't saved enough, well, shame on you for your economic failures, right? So a very individualized, privatized, this is sometimes called a risk shift perspective. The society no longer considers these issues to be social responsibilities. They're exclusively matters of individual risk. In addition to that, there is the fact that as we have become more diverse, as feminism has transformed women's expectations, as feminism and other social forces have transformed the family, we have less rich and specific and solitaristic or communal cultural resources for talking about shared obligations. I think I've pointed in the past to Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, in which he suggests that in the 1950s and 1960s, when Americans spoke about their obligations for the next generation or to the next generation, they typically spoke in collective terms. It's not just my kids, it's how can we assist our kids, the next generation in general. And that in the last 20, 30 years, the vocabulary, the conceptualization, the nature of the implicit social contract has completely changed to the point where we really just speak about my obligation to my kids, my obligation to my parents, and that this is the product of both diversification and marketization of our culture. And this then coincides with a shift away from family wages, away from a wage that allows one worker to support a family, and into two income households. And this means that, of course, people who are going to work, coming home, trying to do routine domestic labor, trying to assist in caring for their kids, especially in an era in which what's sometimes called concerted cultivation, spending more and more time and energy on preparing your kids to do well in school and extracurricular activities, And if you're in the sandwich generation, so-called, also caring for your parents, this has many people feeling that this is simply untenable. So two consequences of this: an impoverished political discourse around care and a woefully inadequate patchwork system of care. So that's to catch you up with where we left off. And I now want to start in on some data with you. I'm going to just jump out for half a second, and I'm going to ask John Campbell, are you here today? I see Ruth. I see Ruth talking to John, right? In about 5 minutes, I was going to point to one of John's diagrams from an article he shared with me, and I
Oh,
wanted him to maybe comment on it.
okay. I'm
Will
here.
that be okay?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry
I
for
don't
not
remember what it
providing
is, but I'm happy to look at it.
well, it's on long-term care insurance in Japan.
Oh, all right.
And I think I mentioned to you briefly that I might want you to do this, but I'm sorry for not giving you a more advanced and
No
specific
problem.
notice. Thank you, John. I appreciate. And so we'll get there in a few minutes. I'm going to start with the more general idea, and that we've got a crisis of care and what its roots are, and that its roots are not just natural or inadvertent, that they really are the product of several intersecting trends. One of them has to do with our policy failures. And so this diagram offers worldwide maps of social policies. And the first category, I know it's hard to see, is time off each week. So mandatory time off from work each week. And the United States is one of 15 countries that does not have mandatory time off legislation, right? And so if you're trying to provide care, you're trying to get your kids from school, you're trying to see your parents or bring a meal to a sick relative, it certainly helps to have maybe 5 hours set aside a week in which you can do that during working hours. And the United States is really basically alone in the developed world in not providing mandatory time off. The second category is paid annual leave. And here the United States is one of 9 countries that does not have paid annual leave legislation, right? And for those of you who have friends from Europe, you may note that they have not just vacation days, they have usually, typically several weeks of paid leave each year. And that's by law. And so there's a much better, among other things, tourist infrastructure in Europe because everybody's traveling for a few weeks a year, or at least many people are. And that includes working class people who have these benefits. In the US, we don't have it. Again, especially if you're geographically distant from relatives who might need your care, living in a society that had paid annual leave would help. And then paid maternity leave. And this varies state by state, but there's not national paid maternity leave in the United States as a matter of law for all professions. And again, here we're one of 6 countries, right? And so you add to that then the fact that after really almost a century of the number of hours worked a day declining, right? They have gone back up since the 1970s to the present, that this is true for almost every category of work, with the exception of low-income men who simply have lost the opportunity to work. And so we've got speed up and policy failures, working more hours, no policy provision for leave on a national basis. This makes it really hard to be a working individual and to provide care at the same time. But we have more and more families where all the adults are working, right? And the explanation for this is quite simple, right? Wages have been stagnant for a very long time. The way in which families have compensated as costs have increased on many critical goods like housing, food, healthcare, and education is by working more, right? And this diagram shows you that there is no place in the United States where the minimum wage is equivalent to a living wage. That is to say, a wage necessary to support a family of four, and that the average gap in the United States is about $20. The minimum wage is about $20 below what a living wage would be. Again, this is leading people on the lower end of the income scale to try to work more and more and leaving less time for care. This leads to what Elizabeth Warren, quite a while ago, as you can see from the cover of the book, she's about 20 years younger, who described as the two income trap. And it's a trap, I think, for two reasons. There's the reason that Warren referred to in the book she co-authored with her daughter, which is that basically, although you're doubling your income, right, going from 20,000 in the 1970s to more than 50,000 in constant dollars in the 2000s, your disposable income is actually slightly less, because in order to support a family where both parents are working, you're paying more for childcare. You're paying more for instance, cleaning or takeout food. You have less time to provide via your own labor critical goods and services that you end up purchasing elsewhere and then spending more money. And so that's the first reason it's a trap. The second reason it's a trap is, this is less emphasized by Warren, but because basically the person who's entering the labor force to earn the extra income is almost always a woman, right? So most of the increase in hours worked per family are accounted for by increased female labor force participation, but women are coming home and doing more housework, right? And so the Arlie Hochschild at UC Berkeley has done very good research on what's sometimes called the double shift, what's sometimes called the time bind, the idea that women come home and still do the bulk of domestic labor, both care labor and household maintenance labor. And the result is that women are more and more stressed, stretched thin. They're experiencing a time crunch as a result. And I think you add to that then the fact that right, families are changing, right? And so as you can see in 1975, nearly 50% of American families were one earner families. That's down to 20% in 2016. The number of families with two parents working has increased, but then so also have the number of families that have a single parent, an unconventional family. And again, just harder and harder to find the time to provide care in these families, right? So this is just a different way of representing similar data, both spouses working, only the husband working, vast increase and decrease respectively. And as you can see across all categories of labor, women are providing more of the domestic and care labor than men are. One more big root of our crisis of care is structural changes in the family itself, right? And I'm speaking in the singular, really it should be plural, in the structure of families, because I don't think we any longer have a prototypical family. And so what we can see on the one hand, right, and this goes generation by generation from people born in the 1920s to 1930s, up to people born in the 1950s to 1960s, what's the likelihood that they're going to be childless, right? And it goes from less than 10% to nearly 20%. What's the likelihood that they're going to have four or more children? It goes from fully a third to right about 10%. And the reason this matters is because if you are planning on your family taking care of you when you get to be older, well, it's going to be a lot easier. This is actually one of the things the literature talks about. You need four children living within half an hour of you if you really want to be cared for by your kids. And guess what? 90% of the population doesn't have four children, let alone four children living within half an hour of you, right? And then in addition to that, if you're thinking, well, maybe your partner will take care of you, um, look at the number of men and women ages 55 to 65 who are divorced, right? And it has gone up from being a very small percentage to being right 15-20% of the population, varying with gender, but it's right again, if you're don't have many children, if you're divorced, the idea that the family is just going to organically, informally take care of you is obviously counterfactual. We have to overcome the hangover of ideas that really have their genesis not only in a period before the lifespan revolution, so people are now living longer and need more care, but also when our families were structured very differently. Um, Other aspects of this have to do with geography, right? And so many kids are moving away to find work because of their uh, partner's job requirement, because they like the lifestyle better on the coast or in the south, and so the distance between the mature child and the parent may be such that it makes it difficult or impossible for the child to be directly and regularly involved in the parent's care. And then, of course, as people are living longer, the need for care is going up. So all of this is to just drill down on the idea that we have a crisis of care in our society, and it's structurally rooted. It's not a chance happening. It is happening because of broad-based social change. It's affecting almost everyone. We should expect that it's going to grow worse in the absence of effective measures to address it. So this then is right the underlying focus of the course. Just to refresh your memory, we are living longer and longer. There are different ways to express this. Come across a couple new ways. One of them is right that at the uh, turn of the 19th century, there was no society in the world where the average lifespan was 40 years or older, right? Think about that for a second, right? That's not that long ago. Turn of the 21st century, there's no society in the world where the average lifespan is less than 40 years. And in the 20th century, we added more years to the average human lifespan than in the previous 200,000 years. The other big century or moment in human history when a lot of lifespan was added was at the beginning of the Iron Age, because cooking with iron implements increased female mortality, increased female lifespan, I should say, dramatically, because the iron in the blood allowed women to better survive childbirth. So all that to say, as opposed to the kind of traditional pyramidic structure of age distribution, we now have something much more rectangular, almost equal numbers of people in elderhood and childhood. And that is, again, something that is just a social demographic fact. And either we put our heads in the sands about it and just try to ignore it or privatize it or leave it to each individual family to cope with on their own. Or as a society, we recognize this is a dramatic, profound social problem. This requires our shared attention. It requires public policy. This is where I'd like John to come in. And so I've got a few different ideas on the board here. On the right side of the board, I show you that the population growth in the United States is slowing, and that's the one half of the lifespan revolution. We have fewer young people, at least fewer young people provided by natural rates of reproduction or replacement rates of reproduction in our society. And then that we are getting older, not as old as Japan, and that's where I'm going to ask us to focus in a second with John's help, but that right now we have almost 20% of our population 65 and older, and that by the end of the century that will go up to 30%. So we're rapidly approaching having 1/3 of our population what used to be considered retirement age or older. Now, the diagram on the left, I cut out of one of John's articles that he shared with me. John, I'm wondering if you could talk us through for a minute or two the long-term care insurance provision in Japan. Are you able to do that?
I'm sorry, I was muted. Yes, I am prepared to do that, although since I had to make a little speech, I prepared that, and I'm not addressing the questions of the two graphs you showed from my article, but
Okay.
Let me go
well,
back a second. I'll just talk for a bit.
You want to see those graphs anyway or not?
No.
Okay.
Let me start with, you're talking about crisis of care. How many people in America think there's a crisis of care, of old age care? 2%, 3%, 4%. It's not, it's a crisis because we think it's going to be really serious, but it's not a crisis on people's minds. If you ask people what are their 10 top worries about the United States, it would be around 25th maybe. So that's a big difference with Japan, because when this stuff started happening in Japan, and it wasn't only long-term care insurance, it goes back to policy changes from 10 or 15 years earlier. It's because people really did think there was a crisis, not of care necessarily. They wouldn't phrase it as that, but it's certainly a crisis of aging, because they looked at those population statistics ahead, and newspapers talked about them all the time, that by God, everything's going to be amazing. You know, the number of old people is growing exponentially, and we're not prepared for it. So that's the main difference between the two countries. But to make a more theoretical point, which is a point in my book, if you're studying policy change, why some policy change happened or what the likelihood of policy change is, something actually has to happen. Explaining why something doesn't happen is, in an academic way, kind of an empty exercise. I mean, all you can do is take a whole bunch of countries and say, well, the US has, you know, less this and somebody else has more that, so therefore they do it and we don't. But it's not usually, and its values are different, culture is different, et cetera, et cetera. The economic structure is different, social patterns are different, but you rarely get a very convincing explanation of because how can you explain a negative? You know, nothing happened. Lots of reasons why nothing happens. So you have to look at places where something happens and then ask why they happened. I wrote another article about Japan and Germany. Those are the only two countries that have a long-term, well, and Korea, only countries that have a long-term care insurance system. And so I sort of compared that, different stories in both places. In Japan, there was a feeling of crisis. That was because of the dramatic speed of aging, which caught very big topic, the aging boom. Newspapers and everybody was writing about it a lot, is one part of it. Another part of it is the structural condition of family care. But when they meant family care, they didn't mean family was paying for it. They meant the old grandmother-in-law was living with you in your rather small house, which many people found oppressive. And that issue got picked up by feminists. This was actually a good time for the growth of the feminist, not the organizations, but the feminist consciousness in Japan. And one of their big issues was that in Japan, it's not just the daughter that takes care of somebody, it's more often the daughter-in-law that has to take care of her husband's parents in their own house. And that got seen with good reason as being really oppressive. And then on the other hand, and the government was facing a problem because Japan didn't have a lot of nursing homes or institutional care, and there wasn't any, and there was no home care to speak of. So people tended to go into hospitals, and because the Japanese had a very lax, permissive health insurance system, people could stay in a hospital for 9 months or 2 years until they died. Was pretty common, but that was extremely expensive, paying for all that hospital care. So there was pressure within the government to do something that would get out from under. Then the third case was Germany had already done this just a few years before. Japanese love to tour around and look at what policy things are going on in other countries, totally opposite of the United States, who never cares. And with that example in front of them, a few entrepreneurs, a couple of bureaucrats, a couple of sort of scholar, politician, not movement people, but academics that are very active socially, they formed, in effect, a sort of a little group to promote the idea of a long-term care insurance system, and it wound up coming through. So that's the sort of process story of it. I can talk about how the system works if you want. I mean, because it's interesting, if we are looking for policy solutions, there are lessons there, but I don't think you're quite at that stage of your discussion right now.
Yeah, and I might come back to you on that, John.
Sure.
I was going to point out, based on the diagram, and by the way, I appreciate you sending me the book manuscript. I wasn't actually able to open it.
Nobody, really?
But I was able to open the article, and
okay,
so that's where I drew the diagram from.
Okay.
That seems to show that the expense of long-term care insurance is increasing rather rapidly in Japan.
Oh, it is, sure, because the old people are increasing rapidly. No question. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? What, medical care costs? Not doing it? I mean, in a sense, it's been a very, very successful program. It's very popular. And conservatives, just the way Republicans talk about Social Security or Medicare here, conservatives grumble about it all the time in Japan, but they couldn't. You know, the cost is not that enormous for.
Yeah, and I didn't mean that as a critique of the program,
No.
As noticing that feature of it. So,
Sure.
let me build on what John is saying here for a second before I get back into the slides. And I'm put in mind if there's some an intellectual historian from Germany who says you don't really have a crisis until you have two components of a crisis, until you have an objective situation that your current social institutions and structures can't solve, right? So you know, we have FDIC insurance set at a level that's almost 100 years old, and now 50% of the deposits in the banks exceed the amount that's insured, right? So that's an objective fact. But the objective fact by itself doesn't create a crisis. You need subjective awareness of the crisis and subjective awareness of it as a crisis, right? And so that second factor maybe is starting to rise to consciousness because of the bank failures of 2008 and now the bank failure of 2023. And we'll have to see if that generates sufficient either ordinary or elite pressure to do something about this. But having said that, John, I want to suggest that I think if you were to ask people what are the 20 most urgent issues facing the country, you're most likely right that most people wouldn't put crisis of care anywhere but on the bottom of that list, if on that list at all, right? But I suspect if you talked to people, or if you were a fly on the wall on the kitchen table when they were talking about their everyday sources of stress, their deepest worries about the future, their deepest disappointments in their ability to meet their own obligations, this would move up pretty close to top 10, top 5, right? And so part of my suggestion here is that this is kind of ripe territory for a political entrepreneur. As I understand the story you just told about Japan, it wasn't actually, and this may have to do with the peculiar dynamics of Japanese politics, that a crafty political operative said, let's seize on this issue. Nobody's talking about it. And if we start talking about it, we'll get a lot of attention. That journalists and bureaucrats instead brought it to attention. But I think in the American context, I mean, that's another path that might be possible. But the more likely path is if, right, all the evidence I just presented you with suggests we already have, you know, an objective crisis of care. We already have subjective stress. I'm looking for a stronger word than stress, right? A kind of widespread subjective sense of individual failure rooted in the objective crisis. What we don't yet have is a shared vocabulary for saying this isn't just my own individual experience, this is a social problem. And in other societies, as well as our own, there are social solutions. We just need to avail ourselves of this. And it's interesting because John talked about Japanese feminism in a sense, having an opening as a result of this issue. And it does seem to me that the feminist movement is one movement in the history of the United States that took what was understood to be a subjective, isolated experience and eventually turned it into something that was a socially relevant problem. And so the reason I present this data and then point a little bit at Japan is to suggest that, yes, this is not just the fact that individuals are failing to figure out how to deliver the care their family members need. It's that there are structural problems in our society that are generating those failures, and that other societies have managed to actually turn the corner from the subjective experience to having a common vocabulary to talk about it.
You know, there's a good case of that in the US, is prohibition.
Yes.
Prohibition was a really big social problem, and people started as an individual problem, and then people thought, well, it's a problem because liquor is being sold every place and guys are getting drunk all the time. The women's movement, of course. And sure enough, we passed prohibition. We made alcohol illegal. It wasn't particularly successful, but it worked. I mean, that was a big policy change that did come out of exactly the kind of process you're talking about.
Well, and I think if we start thinking back in our history, and I'm particularly interested in the history of the public provision of goods that had, up until the moment that new legislation was passed, been only a matter of private responsibility. So the creation of the post office, right, would be maybe one of the first central examples. Public libraries, public schools, eventually Social Security, minimum wage, Medicare, Medicaid, right? And so we've got this history of taking what had been hitherto private problems and turning them into public responsibilities. And after, right, they become public responsibilities, everybody takes it for granted. And right, you know, the Republicans will intermittently speak about taking, you know, away Social Security or privatizing it, or, you know, trying to scale back Medicare or Medicaid benefits because there's a looming crisis of insolvency, and they get punished every time they do, right? Because nobody wants to move that ratchet in the other direction, right? You increase the provision, you change the social contract, people come to rely on that. So yeah, John, I think you're right that we do have some successful examples, and I guess the question is, are we so polarized, right? Is the association of public provision so racialized for so many Americans? Is our government, especially our legislature, especially the Senate, so completely paralyzed that we can't envision doing this now? And it's one of the reasons I'm spending a fair bit of time on these topics, is it seems to me this is one opening in contemporary American politics where so many people are experiencing the same source of stress, that we might just have an opening for having a conversation about how there's a social obligation that the state needs to meet to assist families in providing care for those members of the family who need it. And we got to get into policy, but that's the guiding thread, the background to all of this. Before I get back into the slides, thoughts, questions? John, do you have anything more you want to say at this juncture? I bet you do. No?
Well, I could go on for hours, but I think I'm okay for right now. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else before we get back into the tall grass? Here we go. Okay.
I have been,
Oh, go ahead.
it's Karen Nelson.
Hi,
I've been to countries like Australia that have socialized medicine, and they provide senior places for seniors to live and eat and exist after they turn a certain age. And I think that's what we're going to have to do at some point.
Thank you for that, Karen. And I'm not quite up to policy level details yet, but I think one of the things that America has going for it as a policy regime, it's both a strength and a liability, is federalism. And so the idea that we can experiment with multiple models, perhaps at the state level. And I think that the idea of group provision, state-sponsored group provision, and then we'd have to keep going. Provision that is humane, that supports the agency of the residents. I don't know if you've visited a Medicare or Medicaid supported skilled nursing home, but Louis Aronson in Elderhood referred to them as warehouses for the elderly, right? We need to do better than that in these kinds of facilities. And on the other hand, I think the literature is pretty strong that for many people, quote, aging in place, being able to stay at home and then getting services to them at home is actually a really good option as well. And so maybe a variety of flexible options, as opposed to simply having a one size fits all policy, might be a good idea. But thank you for sharing that, Karen, about Australia. Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, a different end of the spectrum. I spent time with my granddaughter yesterday, who has two little kids, and she works full time. She's got a PhD. She has a very good job. Her husband has a service business, and they struggle to find the care for their kids. Well, of course, it's a sense of money, but also just the availability. But these are young people are so involved in the care and in their jobs that they don't have the energy to see that this is a universal problem and take on the policy and getting involved other than they're just overwhelmed at home. And so I don't know where the energy is going to come. What group is going to pop up and say, hey, this is a problem for all of us?
So thank you for that, Anne. And I'll just add my own little anecdote here, which is I've got a colleague, the main person who teaches American politics at Sarah Lawrence College, who is half-time more often than not, and it creates some difficulties in creating continuity of courses at the school. And you ask him, well, why? Why are you so often taking half your leaving half your salary at work instead of working full time? And he says it's a losing proposition for him. He has 2 young kids, and the cost of childcare is so high that he actually does better economically working half-time, getting his benefits, etc., but being able to basically be a stay-at-home care provider for his kids. In terms of where the energy comes from, if our model here is a grassroots social movement, a care revolution from below, I think you might be right, Ann, that part of the way in which, and frankly, I think, I'm not sure it's intentional, but this is in many respects functional from the perspective of those who have brought about the neoliberal revolution, that we're stretched so thin we don't have time for political organizing anymore, right? But I guess my model is much more what I've called a political entrepreneur. To be more specific, we could say a presidential candidate, right? And let's note that, right, Biden did not run on these issues, really, right? But he did decide in Build Back Better that he wanted to spend, and I think it was $600 billion that he labeled care, right? That this was going to be a care and climate bill. And the care part in particular, he used the language of Ai-jen-poo, an infrastructure of care. And so there was money for universal daycare, universal pre-K, a lot of support for senior housing and home health care aids. That all got cut, right? That didn't make it past Manchin and Sinema's red pens. But having said that, the fact that it was there, I think, indicates that there's perhaps a little bit of a growing understanding on the part of people in the Democratic Party that this is a issue that is ripe for the plucking. Let me add to that. I think this was more central to Elizabeth Warren's campaign. And obviously she didn't get the nomination, but it's rarely the case that the first person who runs on these issues gets the nomination, right? Somebody's got to blaze the path, and then later somebody comes along and actually reaps the rewards. And so, yes, if we're relying on did you say it was your daughter, Ann?
No, this is my granddaughter.
Your granddaughter, who is and I'll just elaborate the roles here for a second, right? Worker, wife, mother, daughter, granddaughter, right? Trying to fill all those obligations at the same time. This is why people feel overtaxed, stretched thin, stressed out, and incapable of meeting their obligations. It's just really hard to do all that well at the same time, right? And then we add that there's a gendered skew to the distribution of this work, that the women do more of it than the men, despite the fact that the women are now in many families actually earning more than the men, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that's that. It is going to make it hard to organize from below. I guess my hope is that maybe some of it might come from above instead. All right. So there's just a couple minutes left, but let me try to get a little bit further today. The next thing I wanted to speak about and this is a little grim, but I think this gets us to really the issue of what happens when we fail to do this. And this is kind of what John was saying about Japan. Well, what's the other choice? Just to let old people either end up in the hospital or end up poor? Well, that's what we do, right? And so the consequence for our society, and I think this is really grim and worth noting, right? The number of elderly people who are sheltered in homeless shelters, right? People over 50, over 60 is increasing, right? And I guess I'll be as direct about this as I can. I think it's morally damaging to each and every one of us to walk past homeless people and to have to either be overwhelmed with compassion and the suffering that it generates to see somebody in that dire a situation, or else to turn off our compassion, our sympathy, to, in a sense, morally deform ourselves in order not to be overwhelmed with the experience. And I think when the person you're seeing is a particularly vulnerable person, a child, a mother, an older person, the moral damage is more extreme. And then just moving away from homeless elderly people and more generally into economically stressed people in elderhood, as you can see, the number of older cost burden renter households keeps going up this century, right? And that is simply because the cost of housing is going up more rapidly than the income is for people over 65 in our country, right? And so that is what's driving the homelessness. It's also driving the fact that 15 million, or basically 1/3 of adults over 65, are close to the federal poverty level, which is not a very generous level to begin with. That this is more likely to be women than men. It's more likely to be Blacks and Hispanics, right? That it's worthwhile noting how much worse it would be without Social Security, as you know, people begin to talk about possibly scaling back Social Security. There are simply millions of older adults struggling to meet their monthly expenses. We are increasingly having an elder poverty crisis in addition to a crisis of care. And I think that gets me to the point where I should probably break off for today, because what I want to do next is talk in more detail about public policy responses. I think there are a number of really good ideas out there. But having said that, because there are a large number, it doesn't make sense to get started on this today. Why don't instead we have a little bit more conversation? Who wants to start us out in thinking about this?
John.
So I see Marion raising her hand.
Yeah. Oh, what seems to be happening among some of my friends who are not living in an institution is that if they've been clever and they've been living in the same apartment for 40 or 50 years, and they have rent stabilization and other ways of keeping their rent reasonable, then they seem to be able to manage rather well. But what seems to happen is that if they get to the point where they would still like to be independent, but they are not able to afford what Piedmont Garden, for instance, requires, which is a hefty admissions price, and then a rent, for room and board, which is considerably higher than what they've been paying. So there, sort of in trouble because they need some of the help that an institution provides. Some of the health coverage, some of the activity, some of the food care, even though some of them are getting home-based food delivery. So you have to be either pretty smart or pretty darn lucky to be able to supply yourself with the care and the social conveniences of a place like the one we're living in. But a lot of people just don't have the money to afford it. And the interesting thing is that in some friends of mine in Europe, the healthcare doesn't provide that intermediate point where you would need a little bit of help, but you're still eager to be independent. In Denmark, for instance, I have a friend who is in that position. And once she got to be quite elderly and quite sick, she was then admitted to a regular healthcare place, a nursing home, which provided everything she needed. But for the 10 years that she was not eager to go into a nursing home, there was no kind of care available for her. So it's been a problem in Western Europe as well as in America.
Yeah, and so those are good comments, and I'll just speak to them for a second. One thing I would say is generally speaking, I think we're dealing with what you might call a cultural lag here, which is to say, our assumptions about the kind of care people need are hangovers from a period in which people were living less long lives, were healthy for less long, right? So remember, it's not just the lifespan, but the health span that has been increased dramatically. And so we don't go as quickly from worker to intensive need for care, right? There's a long intermediary period now.
That's the problem area.
And in addition to that, the expectation that the family would have a lot of kids, that they would stay close to home, and maybe what John was mentioning, and this is true in many cultures, right? The daughter-in-law is responsible, often moves in, right, with the parents, the son's parents, right? There were some social norms that regulated who provided care, and those norms have been challenged, right? And for good reasons, right? They're restrictive, they're sexist, they're incompatible with many features of modern economy and society, right? And so the problem is our policy hasn't caught up with our lifespan, our health span, our changing mores. So that's I think the big scenario, and it's not an American problem alone by any stretch. I would add to what you're saying, Marion, about the way in which the rent stabilized apartment is both godsend and also a kind of trap, right? That even worse, and part of that data I was showing you at the very end about the rise in housing insecurity for elderly people in the United States is if you don't have rent stabilized or rent controlled apartments, right? And then your price of rent goes up as the market will bear, right? Which it's, for the most part, not people like you who's driving the escalation of the rent, people on fixed incomes, right? It's people whose incomes are going up. And then you add to that, and again, Aronson's book has some really riveting stories about people in their 80s with real mobility problems. For instance, climbing 40 stairs to get in and out of their apartments, right? Because the apartment is rent stabilized, because they know they can't get another rent stabilized apartment, but missing medical appointments, not getting to socialize or do other activities they want to do, having to pay more to have groceries delivered, being in a crisis if the person delivering the groceries leaves them at the bottom of the stairs instead of bringing them up, right? And so there are still further complications along these lines with people trying to remain. And I think there's policy stuff we need to be thinking about that supports people in getting into facilities that can provide the care they need, but also that gets the care to the people if they don't want to go into a group home of one kind or another. Yeah, Marion, thank you very much for that. Flossie, you've been very patient. You were raising your hand 5 minutes ago. You're muted still, Flossie. Okay, okay, there you go. You're on. Yep. Nope. Nope. You had it and then you lost it. You're still muted. You got to hold the space bar down if that's what you're doing, or hold that icon down. Uh-oh, did we lose? No, okay. Flossie, you're still muted. You turned your camera off, I think. Okay, now you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I have nothing to declare except that there are other problems with aging where some of us have to take care of our family from this position, and it ain't easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I guess I would add is filial obligations go both ways, right?
Yes.
They don't, or many ways maybe would be the better way to put it. And so, yes, it's a tricky position. And, you know, again, this is a broad and difficult conversation. How can we reconcile modern social conditions, which really treat us very much as like independent individuals who have to do what we need to do to start our careers, take care of ourselves, with the fact that we're also social creatures that are raised in families that want to meet the obligations of love and the duties of care to each other, right? And I'm not saying they're easy solutions. I'm saying it's a conversation we desperately need to be having, and that I think that the politicians who find the way to begin talking about this may find an opening, and an opening that could be transformative for our culture. John, do you have your hand up again?
Yes, I have one final comment, which is there's been a lot of publicity about a bunch of polls that show that the older you are, the happier you are. People over 80 are the happiest, people in their 70s are next, people in their 60s are next, and it goes right down to about 30 or something, and then it gets confusing, but it's and it's a big difference too. And those are people, you know, that's a simple survey question on a big sample of saying, how happy are you? So
Yeah.
and everybody here is happy, so.
And this is true across over 70 countries where these kinds of polls
That's true.
have been conducted. And there's good explanations for this. I think I might have talked about this in an earlier lecture, but some of it has to do with the fact that you've discharged some of your obligations, right? So they call that the Dolce Vita effect. You just don't have to worry about that stuff as much as you used to. Some of it has to do with time orientation, that when you're younger, and by the way, this is a U curve. When you're like in your teens and your 20s, you're pretty happy. Then it goes downhill 30s, 40s, 50s, and then it starts to go back up again. Part of it is time orientation, that in that period from 30 to 50, you're really focused much more on the future, what you can do to advance your career, to meet your obligations to your children and your parents. By the time you get to your 60s, you're starting to focus more on the present again. And then the third factor, interestingly, is a kind of social invisibility. And you get this a lot in the surveys. I've stopped caring about what people think about me. I don't think they even look at me anymore. And that gives me freedom to do whatever the hell I want to do, right? I'm not trying to meet social expectations so much anymore. I've outgrown that. So yeah, and so look, as long as we're financially secure, as long as our care needs are not, right, grossly unmet, this could be a really happy period. It could be a really meaningful period. It could be a really important period for people. It could be a really productive period, which would be valuable to society as well as to the people living through it. But we have to put the floor underneath it, where you're not homeless, where you're not trading off between paying your rent or paying your utilities or paying your medical bills, where you're not wondering, if I can't get out to the grocery store, how am I going to eat tomorrow? You know, those are things that will very quickly undermine happiness. All right, everybody. I hate to end on that note. Well, are you raising your hand? I can't see. Who's that with Donald? Is that Bonnie?
No, Peggy.
Peggy. Hi, Peggy. Sorry.
I've been here all the time, but not necessarily attracted to attention. Singapore has this problem too, and they are just horrified that we have neglected the poor so much. So I think it's all over the place.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, when my colleague from Singapore came to speak in my class in 1988, the women had plenty to say after he left. And they are really resent having so much stuff laid on them.
And I do know not enough about Singapore, but I do know that it is a racially diverse society, 3 main ethnic groups, if I understand it correctly. And I do think that in certain respects, we have this same problem here, right? The widespread perception that the main beneficiaries of government services are not people who look like us, right? It's racial minorities. And then we could start filling in all of the negative stereotypes that are used to account for why racial minorities rely on governmental services and the majority ethnic group doesn't. It turns out it's totally false, right? But nevertheless, it's part of an ideology, part of a political strategy that makes it easier to neglect social provision. Thank you for that, Vicky. And anybody else with a comment for today? All right, take care. And I think we're going to be able to bring this conversation to a conclusion next week, assuming there's not one of the major issues currently on the back burner of our politics all of a sudden thrust up front that requires our attention. So I'll look forward to seeing everybody next week. Take care of yourselves. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.